I'm Brian Hiatt. This is Rolling Stone Music Now. One of my colleagues, David Browne, just released a new book that's unlike a lot of music books. It's not really about a particular artist or band or genre. It's about a place, a neighborhood. The book is Talkin Greenwich Village, the heady rise and slow fall of America's Bohemian music capital. And the story touches on everyone from Nina Simone to Bob Dylan and beyond. I'd also argue that the book reminds us just how much of the ethos of the 1960s was born in that one Manhattan neighborhood. Here's my conversation with David Browne. What made the West Village the West Village? How did it become a magnet for this incredibly wide variety of music and creativity and poetry over many years and many genres? And it didn't start in 1960. It started in the late 30s, really, it seems like.
Right.
Was there a geographical or other reason, spiritual, whatever it is, reason that it became what it became?
Yeah, there was. I mean, geographical is actually a big part of it in a way. Ever since the early 1800s, right? The grid of the village was figured out, and it doesn't conform to the normal grid of parallel intersecting streets of a city. Anyone who knows who's gone down to Greenwich Village, the streets kind of zigzag, and some are cobblestone. The buildings are not as tall as other parts of the city. It was a village within a city. It felt cut off from everything else, and I think that in a way started attracting. Also, it was cheap to live down there, even way back when.
Hard to imagine now.
That helps. Yes, totally hard to imagine. But there was a time when you could pay $50 a month rent. Even in the last century. But it started attracting writers and artists. It became a kind of gathering spot for writers, artists, and painters. I think partly because it was a little bit off the grid. And, starting in the 30s and continuing on, you could just wander into a coffee shop and just kind of grab some coffee and sit there and hang out with your friends for hours. But that really became more the case later in the 50s and 60s. But it felt like a place, it felt like a community of kind of radical thinkers, outsiders, bohemians. Even before it became a tourist place, it had its own particular feel and its own literary history, with Willa Cather and Stephen Crane and Mark Twain, and you can go down the list of people like that. So it had a reputation already as a place that attracted artists. And so I think music was just the inevitable next step.
In 1938, there was, of course, this landmark From Spirituals to Swing concert at Carnegie Hall, produced by John Hammond, who would later have a lot of roles to play in musical history and West Village history. I knew about that, but I didn't know that the Cafe Society in the West Village hosted its own events of the same name. In 1940, they had one where you could go see, at one event, for $1.50 a ticket, according to your book, Billie Holiday, Art Tatum, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe. It's mind-blowing, and it shows how much was going on in the West Village in a time when people don't really think about 1940 in the West Village.
It is absolutely mind-boggling. That continues decades. If you flip through old issues of like the Village Voice in the 60s, and you will see those kinds of bills, not all those artists, but those kind of bills like every night, on one weekend in multiple clubs. And all that did start, back in the 30s. You had the Cafe Society, which was a basement club on a place called Sheridan Square that was opened by a very progressive-minded shoe salesman from New Jersey who wanted to open a space. And, one of his first clients was, hirings, I should say, was Billie Holiday. And he also hired boogie-woogie piano players from around the country and jazz people. His name was Barney Josephson. And he envisioned a place where black and white crowds could get together and enjoy a wide range of music. And in a way, that kind of set the template for music to come in the village and the way it would attract different styles and different audiences, sometimes together. And in his case, he had no problem with booking Billie Holiday early on and made headlines when she performed for the first time ever in that club in the late 30s, a song called Strange Fruit, which was a very startling, jarring song about a lynching.
There's strange fruit blood on the leaves.
And it would always be performed at the end of her set. They would ask the waiters not to take orders or talk. They wanted to make it this big dramatic moment. And it was. You know, it's a very eerie, spectral song, if anybody knows it. And she would sing it, and some people would leave because they were really upset about it. But it made sort of headlines, and it sort of, in a way, started to put the Village on the map as a place where you could hear music, whether it was jazz or folk and some rock, that was maybe not say off the grid, but was music that took chances. And it wasn't necessarily under the big spotlight of show business. And, you know, you could try, if you were Nick Coleman, you could try playing free jazz down there, which also would drive people out of the clubs. If you were Dylan, you could say, well, I wrote this song called Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall. It's 7 minutes long. I'm going to give it a shot. You know, you couldn't necessarily do that in other places, especially in New York City.
It's a hard rain, they're gonna fall.
It's always important to remember how many of these things started so much earlier than people realize. Here you have Billie Holiday in 1939 performing protest music in the West Village a good 20 years before people think of protest music in the West Village. So it's, you know, all the stuff started earlier. And you know, obviously there was an entire world of jazz in the West Village, you know, again, well before the sort of folk scene that people think of. But also in around 1941, you already had Pete Seeger and the Almanac Singers, which eventually included Woody Guthrie, playing in the West Village. I guess Woody kind of came and went pretty quickly from the group, but, you know, again, 20 years earlier, which is why it must have been so incredible for Pete Seeger to see what the whole thing became 20 years later.
There they are singing, like, you know, labor songs, pro-union songs. At one point, all living in the same building on 10th Street. It was just called Almanac House, hence the name of the group. Of course, also instantly attracting the FBI, which would become another issue that would follow the Village for decades, the kind of oversight of the government. Between that and Billie Holiday, and then Pete Seeger's following group, the Weavers, also came together in the Village. You had the seeds of a scene that was pushing a lot of envelopes. I mean, we don't really necessarily think of that as folk music, or even before Dylan in that form. But what was established there, the types of clubs and the type of music and the lyrics and the kinds of songs, was very ahead of its time and very controversial.
Yeah, a few things were happening that helped put an end to that era of the scene. As you said, there were a lot of investigations of people for, you know, being communists. And then New York was very big on this cabaret license law. They were using this to shut down clubs and keep performers from performing. Was that mostly just a sort of revenue generating scam?
Well, there are some people who think that there was a racial element. Because those started, you know, when black and white audiences started dancing together, especially uptown, it sort of freaked people out. And suddenly there became more stricter cabaret laws, like you say, where in certain zones, you know, you couldn't have more than 3 instruments. You couldn't have a singer. You couldn't have drums. And performers had to get cabaret cards. So people like Billie Holiday and Thelonious Monk, for example, who played at the 5 Spot, which is a jazz club down there, they couldn't play down there for a while because if you had anything on your record, you were denied a cabaret card. So there were multiple attempts, and this would go on again for decades, to kind of monitor music in the Village, to keep an eye on it, to suppress it to some way or another. It was threatening in a way. And that even spilled over into Washington Square Park when there would be like these Sunday afternoon hootenannies, and that became monitored, and you had to get permits, and police would watch, make sure it ended exactly on time at 6 o'clock on Sundays. And yes, and then going back to the Weavers and Pete Seeger being called before HUAC to testify about his political beliefs, and FBI agents, as I saw in some paperwork, confronting another member of the Weavers, Fred Hellerman, in front of his apartment, asking him, his apartment was in the West Village, about his affiliations. And it was kind of fascinating. There's a lot of this I didn't know. Some of it I did, but some of the more detailed information I didn't know. And it really gave a bigger picture to the whole scene.
Yeah, you mentioned what was going on in Washington Square Park. We should illuminate that a little bit. As early as 1945, there were folk sing-alongs in Washington Square Park. Again, not to harp on this theme, but there were so many harbingers of what was to come. And also, again, this stuff got started so much earlier than people realize.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the recurring threads throughout the book is the way that this whole scene was under many different watchful eyes over decades until it really kind of peaked, I think, in the 80s. You had the city, you had, with its cabaret laws, you had the police keeping an eye on things, you had landlords always intervening, you had the mob, and all of these things. And these seemingly quaint Sunday afternoon jam sessions in Washington Square Park became this very contentious thing. They did start in the late 40s. By the mid-50s, people would just start congregating in Sunday afternoons around the fountain that's still there. They'd bring their guitars and banjos and whatever else, and they'd form little groups or play by themselves. And it was, people like John Sebastian of the Lovin' Spoonful and Ramblin' Jack Elliott and maybe Dylan, we're not sure, but many people would visit that and hang out. Dave Van Ronk was a regular. But starting in the late 40s, you had to get a permit to play in Washington Square Park, which is strange to think of in and of itself, that you couldn't just show up. Somebody in the group of people had to fill out a form, get it stamped by approval by the New York City Department of Parks, and then you could proceed to sing in the park. And more people started showing up by the late 50s, early 60s. It was, you have hundreds of people there, but, and they were playing not loud music, they were playing music. And sometimes there would be bongos. It would be a little loud. And after a while, the new parks commissioner could have had enough. He'd heard protests from the people around. They just decided to stop it altogether and only have performances by, orchestras or more formal kind of things. And there was a thing called the Beatnik Riot. What was supposed to be a calm protest in the park turned into this like mini melee. Cops showed up. They knew there was going to be a protest. People started singing anyway when they weren't supposed to. The cops charged and pushed people into the fountain, which did not have water in it. Should have had, but it was still quite a scene. Made the page one of all the newspapers in the Daily News, and called the Beatnik Riot. Even though I don't think there were that many beatniks there, but it really was such a visceral example, and kind of put it out there in the world that I think much more, even more so than things that happened in the past, that the Village was this sort of counterculture epicenter.
Yeah, and again, that was a moment that really presaged a lot of the 60s. You have underground youth culture clashing against the cops 6 or 7 years before it would happen more broadly, before the Vietnam War even. One of the people involved in that protest that became a quote-unquote riot was this guy, Izzy Young, who was an interesting player in the popularization of folk through the West Village. Tell me a little bit about him.
Yeah, Izzy was this just archetypal New York character. Big, gruff, loud-speaking, bespectacled guy. Loved rare books and square dancing. And in 1957, which was a really pivotal year in the Village, many things started coming together then, including the beginnings of what would be Gertie's Folk City, where Dylan and others would start. Izzy opened a place called the Folklore Center on McDougal Street, which was a little tiny space, like they all were, that sold sheet music and instruments and maybe some records. And it became this gathering spot for anybody coming into town. Within a few years, you had people like Dylan and Judy Collins and Tom Paxton and all these people coming to the Village from all different parts of the country because they heard this was the place to be. And one of their first stops was always Izzy Young's Folklore Center. And Izzy was very opinionated. He was a real purist. He hated like the commercial folk music, Kingston Trio type stuff. He could easily throw people out of the store if he didn't agree with them. He was a real guardian of it. But he was also, that store was such a magnet. It was where Dylan would have people send his mail, before he had a place to live. There would be, like a little bulletin board. I spoke to Christopher Guest for the book, who grew up in that neighborhood, and he would go in there. He was a young guitar player. He would see Dylan be reaching for a guitar to try it out, or he'd see Dave Van Ronk, who was the bedrock guy of the scene, and be completely scared about him. But it was the Folklore Center was a real key part of this scene. And Izzy Young was a very progressive, again, a real lefty. And it also was that it was a place where politics and music came together, which was another key factor in the scene.
Yeah, inevitably, Dave Van Ronk was going to be a key figure in this book, and he is, and you sketch him very well, and he's kind of Zelig-like, keeps popping up over the years. I think a good intro to him for people is that he is, in essence, the character in Inside Llewyn Davis was loosely based on his life and on his incredible posthumous memoir that I'm a big fan of, that people should read. But a lot of the biographical details of Llewyn Davis were taken from Dave Van Ronk, and he was quite a character. He was a little bit of the king of the scene, albeit displaced by Dylan. He always was kind of one of the popes of the scene, saying what was real and what wasn't, and trying to draw the line.
I made him a through line of the book, as you say, because he was there very early on in the late 50s when there was barely a scene. He was there until his death in 2002. The whole time he lived in the village, a couple different places, but he was a real foundational kind of character. He was the one that everybody wanted to meet when they showed up in towns. Many of them took guitar lessons with him. He didn't so much sing, he kind of barked out his songs, although he could have a sweet timbre to his voice as well. But yes, he absolutely he embodied something about the village that I think runs rampant through many of the musicians that followed as well, which is a certain uncompromising, take me for what I am quality. He wasn't averse to selling records. He had a brief, short-lived rock band in the mid-'60s, as many did. Aside from that, he did have certain kind of rigid rules about music. He had that uncompromising quality, that melding of styles, too. He hated being called a folk singer because he loved jazz and blues as much as anything else. And that, in a way, all that music was thriving, even the rock stuff, was thriving in the village during those years that he was there. He would freely give advice about the music business, anybody who wanted to pick his brain about what he knew about it. He was just this really inspirational, almost aspirational figure for a lot of people. And his trajectory parallels the village, too. He was there early on when it was just starting. He was there when Dylan arrived. He saw it become a more commercial entity. He declined to be in Peter, Paul, and Mary because he just didn't think that was right for him. He was there when it went electric and all his friends started forming rock bands. He was there during its downtime in the late 60s, early 70s, and having a rough time making a living. And he was there, in the late 70s, early 80s, when it had its last kind of big gasp, and a new generation came in, the Suzanne Vegas of the world, and he supported them. So he was a really key figure in that scene, and not just because of Llewyn Davis.
Right. Again, if anyone enjoyed that movie, they should check out his book, because there's a lot of things that are taken directly from his book.
The merchant marine part. Oh, they should add that if you talk to people who knew him back then, they're not big fans of that movie. They feel like it, and not necessarily because necessarily. I mean, they all say, "Oh, that really wasn't Dave." Dave didn't crash on people's couches. People crashed on Dave's couches, which is true. Dylan, among many others, would crash on he and Dave's then wife's, Terry Thall's, couch in their apartment. Dave was not that itinerant guy. The big objection they have is they feel like it's so dour and depressing. And that the scene was actually much livelier, much more supportive. There wasn't as much bickering. From talking to people, I think they have a point. It was a saucier scene in every way. There was a lot of drinking and sleeping together, and there was definitely competitive edge for sure. But I can kind of see their point that it wasn't quite as bleak and autumnal as you get from Llewyn Davis.
The biggest difference, and the reason it wasn't actually a Dave Van Ronk biopic, it was more that they gave a fictional character some aspects of his life, is that Llewyn Davis, the whole thing was he had a Simon and Garfunkel type partner. He had like a Garfunkel who had committed suicide. That was kind of hanging over the whole movie. And that was one of the reasons it was such a dark movie. And I always wondered if that movie was actually about the Coen brothers talking about their own collaboration in some coded way, about what it would be like to miss your artistic partner. And then they promptly broke up as an artistic unit, at least temporarily. So who knows?
Right. Well, there was a guy down there named Paul Clayton who was a friend of Van Ronk's. He was a little bit higher up on the professional rungs. Who was part of the scene, who did kill himself. But they were not in a duo.
Right.
But I often wondered if they used Paul Clayton.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be. Then to get to a rather major moment in the Village and musical history, you've dropped this name a couple times. This is the end of Llewyn Davis. He arrives like a hurricane to end all that was. One day, 1960, a little pudgy kid shows up. Someone in your book says he's pudgy and dirty, and that is a very young Bob Dylan. It's not necessarily auspicious at first. Some people got it, but a lot of people didn't see it. He wasn't playing a lot of originals at first, and a lot of people, it seems like from your book, were just like, who is this kid? What's the deal with his voice? When is he going to go away? It wasn't like everyone immediately bowed down to his genius.
Absolutely not. I mean, like Judy Collins told me the first time she heard him at Gertie's, she thought he was awful and the songs were terrible. It was not long afterwards, when he started writing, she realized how great he was and left him a little note at the Izzy Young Folklore Center about one of his songs. The thing to remember about Dylan, too, is that when he showed up in 61, there was a scene. I mean, everything was in place for him, in a way. There were the Gaslight Cafe, which would become one of his places, had fully transitioned from a poetry hangout and poet hangout to a music place. Gertie's Folk City had just started presenting folk music months before that. You had people like Van Ronk and who were already making their name on the scene. Everything was like set up, and there were people who I think many people assumed would become kind of big. And this kid comes kind of out of nowhere. Yeah, real gruff voice. You have to remember, too, some of the singers from the Village, folk singers from like the 40s and 50s, like a Pete Seeger and some of his fellow Weavers, or there's a guy named Richard Dyer Bennett who sang these very courtly kind of
there once was a
that scene in Animal House, of Stephen Bishop, scene in Animal House.
Yeah.
Like those guys. And that was prevalent. And so to have this kid show up with this raw voice, and it's kind of bringing this like rock and roll energy really to his singing guitar playing was jarring to a lot of people. I was reminded of in this book, of course, is how fast things happen. Like he had a record deal with Columbia within 9 months of showing it. For someone who showed up with not many songs, and not many connections, it was shockingly fast. And he was such a disruptor in that scene in ways good and bad, perhaps. But he really shook the whole thing up in a way that you had this nice little scene moving along, and suddenly he's writing these songs like Blowin' the Wind, and his new manager, Albert Grossman, says, Peter, Paul, and Mary, a group he assembled, basically, they should do that song and build a more commercial version. And once that happens, the other great disruption is everybody around Dylan, who weren't writing that many of their own songs, were like, if he could do it, if this kid with his chops or in their minds, questionable chops, can like write these songs, get them covered and make money and make have a whole other thing going on. Well, maybe I can do it too. And suddenly many more people started writing original songs, which led to this whole great new American songbook in a way that emerged from the Village.
Before people started writing their own songs, as you said, people whose previous repertoire had, come out of the South from the 20s and 30s and were on the, anthology of American folk music type songs, were instead singing a song written by the kid hanging out in the club next door. They all started performing these Bob Dylan songs. Peter, Paul, and Mary, let's take a step back. It was Albert Grossman, who was Dylan's manager and was this mercenary / visionary attached to the scene, saw that it could be brought to a wider audience. So explain his idea for Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Yeah, I think, Grossman was one of those people. He had a folk club in Chicago called the Gate of Horn, but then he kind of moved here. And
for people who've seen Inside Llewyn Davis, the scene where Llewyn Davis he hitchhikes out and performs at the club in Chicago to, I forget if it's literally Albert Grossman or just the Albert Grossman figure, and he's the guy who says, I don't hear any money in it. But yeah, sorry, continue.
Exactly. Grossman definitely was somebody who saw the commercial potential of that, and especially when you had stuff like the Kingston Trio and Tom Dooley, selling a lot of records. The Kingston Trio had several albums in the top 10 at once, back around 1959 to 60.
And these were like crew cut dorks, basically doing them. Yeah, right?
Crew cut dorks. And I think Grossman's idea was to loosen that up, make it maybe a little sexier, a little bit more authentic. And he had in his mind, like, oh, we should, this is, Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary told me this in an interview years ago. That it was Grossman's idea, like, well, we should have maybe a blonde, and then we'll have like a serious kind of guy, and then we'll have maybe someone who's more like jokey, comic-y on stage. And if you have that kind of blend, so they kind of went about, he already knew Peter Yarrow from booking him, so the Mary Travers lived in the area, and everybody sort of knew her from singing around, and Noel Stukey was down the block at the Cafe Wild, had a pretty nice voice. And as we said before, Grossman first approached Dave Van Ronk to be in the group, and Van Ronk thought about it and said, that's not quite for me. But Grossman, he put these three together. The thing is that their voices blended beautifully, but also because they were all village people, no pun intended, that later group, they were all Greenwich Village people, and they all had a certain authenticity to them in that scene. So I think that really helped in terms of them being accepted in that world. They weren't like carpetbaggers.
Right.
And I think, and the fact that they were open to covering, songs by Dylan and others was a big part of it. But they had their roots in that world. So I think that went a long way. They weren't just seen as like a commercial grab.
In 1962, Peter, Paul, and Mary had 3 top 10 pop hits. The first was their version of If I Had a Hammer.
If I had a hammer, I'd a hammer in the morning, I'd a hammer in the evening.
And then, which was, in fact, a Pete Seeger song, fresh from the blacklist. So, props to them for that, for getting Pete Seeger back into the pop mainstream. I actually didn't even I'd never really put that together before. That's pretty interesting. Then they had Puff the Magic Dragon by Peter Yarrow.
Puff the Magic Dragon lived by the sea.
Puff the Magic Dragon was, I did not realize this, was a number 2 pop hit in 1962. And then they had one more song go to number 2, and that was Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan.
How many roads must a man walk down before?
Really interestingly, that was a lot of people's introduction to Bob Dylan. And yet for younger generations, I have heard the Peter, Paul, and Mary version, I probably single digit times, really. I know it, but it's the Bob version that lasted because it just sounds more modern to us.
How many roads must a man walk down before you call him?
But at the time, that was the kind of version people wanted to hear, wasn't it? The Peter, Paul, and Mary version.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine Dylan's voice on AM radio.
In 62, yeah.
In 62, 63. By 65, like a Rolling Stone, okay, but also he's got a rock band behind him. His style was way too raw, I think, for that time. But I think Blowin' in the Wind is such an important song on so many levels. I mean, it helped put Dylan on the map as a songwriter. It kind of announced him to the world. It gave that first major hit, one of the first major hits to Peter, Paul, and Mary, kind of really established them. And I think it also established the Village as a place, because I think people knew that's a song from that part of New York City and those people, because it was the first major hit to come out of the world written by one of that new generation. And of course, it had a long whole backstory in itself that's really fascinating. Peter, Paul, and Mary were not the first group to record it. The first version was by a group called the New World Singers, included a guy named Happy Trowne, who was a mainstay of the scene, and also a woman named Dolores Dixon, who was one of the few, black women singers on the scene.
How many roads must a man walk down before he's called a man?
Dylan was friends with the New World Singers, and was close with Dolores Dixon, their lead singer. And those guys actually did the very first version of "Blowing in the Wind," but it was not released on Warner Brothers Records, like Peter, Paul, and Mary's.
Right.
But it's a fascinating thing. You can hear it online. It's a much quainter, more jovial, almost Weavers type version. But it also gives you that sense of the potential that song had.
So it's interesting, like pop culturally speaking, decades don't necessarily start when the clock turns to 1960. I think people sometimes trace the beginning of the quote unquote 60s in a pop cultural sense to the Beatles hitting North America. But I think maybe a better place to start might be Blowin' in the Wind, hitting number 2 in the pop charts in 1962. It's a kind of an interesting, well before the Beatles.
You can make that case because it also embodied the Kennedy years, that sort of energy and that vibe that came from him, and what he brought to the White House, and his charisma and some of his policies. He was the president when that was happening, and Peter, Paul, and Mary, to me, almost like the soundtrack to the Kennedy years in some ways. And I think you could totally make the case that the 60s started as much with that song becoming a huge record, being all over the radio and selling hundreds of thousands of copies when it came out. It's not a rabble-rousing protest song at all, but the way that it just poses these kind of philosophical kind of questions was very 60s, more than 50s. I think it brought that musical change with it and lyrical change with it at the same time to the mainstream.
It gets shortchanged a little bit because, like I said, it does sound dated. Even by, the 80s or 90s, it sounded way more dated than, Bob Dylan. Now it sounds positively. It sounds like it's from another planet. It just didn't, that style didn't age well. But again, it's just easy to forget that Bob Dylan was on the pop charts before the Beatles were, albeit through other voices. Right. But it's just very, very interesting because I think people might have it as the reverse in their heads, Right.
And this was also, you have to also keep in mind, this was a fallow period for rock. Elvis had come out of the army, but wasn't quite what he was. Buddy Holly was dead. All that stuff we hear in, the day the music died and all of that. You had the Beach Boys and some stuff happening, but it was the era of the teen idol, Fabian type pop stars dominating the charts, not so much rock and roll. And so this kind of folk music was kind of a new rock, as odd as I might seem to say. It had this fresh energy to it. It had this vitality to it. And it had an earthiness to it that, as you say, maybe it sounds dated now. But if you heard Peter, Paul, and Mary, or I don't know if you would have heard Ian and Sylvie on the radio, probably not much, but it was the polar opposite of Frankie Avalon and all of that other stuff that was happening at the time. It felt related. It felt human. Is what it was. It felt like people could relate to it. Just
to jump back to 1961, it was amazing to realize that as Dylan is arriving in the Village at around this same time, Ornette Coleman is debuting free jazz. And John Coltrane, in November of that year, was recording his legendary set of shows at the Village Vanguard. It just goes to the point of your book. So much incredible creativity was happening all at once in the space of a few blocks, really.
You could catch an early set by, let's say, Muddy Waters might show up and play at the Cafe Go-Go. Then you could cross the street to the Village Gate and maybe see, I don't know, Nina Simone, Miles Davis, whatever. And all that was happening. The free jazz scene that started in the Village around the same time, as almost the same year, as Dylan. It's kind of an incredible thing to think about, that you had all this music that was actually kind of rubbing a lot of people the wrong way, but was this incredibly forward thinking in so many ways. And the Village kind of welcomed that.
Also in 1961 was an artist you mentioned a few times, and really an artist who I think people don't talk about enough because of the way she straddled so many genres. In some ways, she felt pre-rock, but she was not quite jazz. And, you know, Nina Simone, we actually did an episode when she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years ago where I talked to her brother. It's really interesting. I recommend people go back and hear that. She was such a fascinating human being and artist. And in 1961, she recorded another live album in the Village, at the Village Gate, which included House of the Rising Sun, which just shows all the different lives that song has.
There is a house in New Orleans.
Around that time, she also did Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood.
But I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh, Lord.
The Animals, the thing I always love is that the Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood riff that they took from Nina Simone's version.
I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
And then Nina ended up doing some of the best versions, as Bob himself has said, some of the absolute best versions of Bob Dylan songs.
Nina Simone, again, like embodied that thing about the Village where she was originally like a classical player and then kind of went more into jazz and standards. And then her music started kind of loosening up in the 60s. And she started, by the end of the 60s, she was getting into more funk and more R&B. But in the early 60s, the Village Gate on Bleecker Street, one of many clubs that no longer exists, unfortunately, became one of her home bases. She would take these folk songs and these spirituals and gospel songs and just completely reinvent them for herself. She would inhabit them in a way.
Her version of Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues is incredible.
When you're lost in Juarez and it's Easter time too.
Dylan actually said in this fascinating 2015 speech at the Music Eras Awards, this just goes to the point of your book of like how much synergy was happening in one place. Nina Simone, Dylan said, I used to cross paths with her in New York City in the Village Gate nightclub. She was an artist I definitely looked up to. Imagine that, Bob Dylan saying that about anybody. She recorded some of my songs that she learned directly from me, sitting in a dressing room. She was an overwhelming artist, piano player, and singer. I just love that crossover.
And that kind of thing would happen, just like all the time there. Although there was it was interesting, I learned there was a certain wall between the folk and jazz worlds. There wasn't a whole...
Yeah.
Dylan was one of the few people, in his own book, he talks about sitting in with Cecil Taylor, who was really...
he probably was lying, though. Everything in his book is... that book is not known for its accuracy, but yeah.
This is true. Well, maybe we'll grant him that one. But even if it did happen, it was extremely rare. It was extremely rare. They were kind of different universes. But they all kind of, coexisted peacefully, I'd say, in different parts. The jazz clubs were a little more west, and the whole Bleecker and McDougal scene was a little more folk and then later rock. So there were sections within the neighborhood that was really kind of fascinating as well.
There was a time, even in the 60s, when the sort of success of the Village started to kill it, when it was overrun, and it just wasn't what it was, I think, even by around 67.
Right. It's funny in a way that to this day, everybody points to the Beatles and Hard Day's Night as this momentous moment in their career. If you talk to any musicians, as I'm sure you have, Brian, who were around then, they're like, I saw them on Ed Sullivan. It could be everybody from Alice Cooper and many others. And they changed my life, and I wanted to form a band. And that happened in the Village, and also to a degree. Because by 64, the folk thing was starting to feel maybe a little stale. That's when Dylan put out Another Side, which a great record that had only one sort of semi-protest song on it. It was a more personal record. He got a lot of grief for that, too, back then, which I'd forgotten about. People think he got grief at Newport. No, he got grief a year before for Another Side. But things were changing, and you had people like John Sebastian, who was a local, folky, who everybody turned to him for harmonica playing. You had like a guy named Jesse Colin Young, who had relocated to the city, and they were doing the basket houses and whatnot. And then suddenly the Beatles, and they were like, oh, let's form a band. Suddenly you had the Love and Spoonful, you had the Youngbloods, you had the Blues Project, who were a major band from that time, and many others. One was called the Sellouts, which I thought was hilarious. But the result was that suddenly the Village went electric itself right after Dylan did, and you had more tourists, the streets got more crowded, It attracted more drug dealers. There were many more arrests. Hard drugs, heroin started coming into the neighborhood. As dealers would see there'd be runaways coming into the village to hang out. So it became more successful, but it became the victim of its own success. And by then, a lot of the original people, Dylan, Phil Oakes, Eric Anderson, many others, left, by then, by 67. A lot of them went to California, Woodstock, wherever. And so a lot of the major artists were gone. They kind of outgrew the scene. And the scene started getting grimier, and all those bands like the Lovin' Spoonful broke up, and there were all kinds of things happening. So suddenly by 68 or so, it seemed like it was almost over. And it would take a number of years for it to really kind of rev back up again. Clubs would continue, but, it's funny to think that the Grateful Dead played it in 1969. The Cafe A Go-Go, which had a slightly different name at the time, but, it's a little basement 400-seat club on Bleecker Street. So there was still it was still a magnet for bands to play. But the kind of, the bloom was off the rose as it was by the late 60s. Gertie's Folk City, which was the epicenter for a lot of this. It was across the street originally from where the Bottom Line would be. But the owner, Mike Porco, was very supportive, but he wasn't a big fan of like electric instruments and bands. He wouldn't have as much of that. So there were things like that at play. And changes in the music as well. I think the village wasn't always conducive to rock and roll after a certain point, and a lot of that was noise complaints and things like that. So the changes in the music as it got away from kind of the folk thing, and jazz went into its own little funk in the mid to late 60s as well. It got too far out and drove people away. So there were all kinds of musical changes that also impacted on the scene. A lot of jazz artists went to, like Dexter Gordon, couldn't get work, went to Europe, from New York. They just left town altogether. So it had a real fallow period there.
Well, again, there's a lot more to the book, and I encourage everyone to check it out and to take the narrative past the 70s, which your book very much does. David, thanks so much for joining me, as always.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here.
And that's our show. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, subscribe to Rolling Stone Music Now, wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us 5 stars and a nice review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, because that's always appreciated. But as always, thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next week.